Hello, and welcome to the History of the Railways, a podcast with the ridiculous goal of telling the story of the railways across the world. Season 1, Episode 4, The Rainhill Trials Part 1, Engines and Engine Makers. In the last episode, we saw how the essential elements of the railway, the track, locos, people and rolling stock, came together to form a working railway in the opening of the Stockton and Darlington in 1825. The super short version of that episode was that the S&DR was a pivotal moment in the history of the railways, the first time when most of what was needed was brought into one place. But even on the opening day, there were people looking ahead. Midway through the 23 toasts on the S&DR opening day were toasts to both the Leeds and Hull and the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. It's the last of those that we're going to turn our attention to today, in the first of a two-parter. We're going to look at how the L&MR answered their motive power question by holding a competition that would go down in history, the Rainhill Trials. But before we do, we need to answer our last trivia question. On the last episode I asked, apart from some of Trevithick's experiments, what was the first locomotive to have inclined cylinders? The answer was the Lancashire Witch, built in 1828 by Robert Stephenson and Company. Stephenson's The Experiment, built in 1827, did have horizontal cylinders embedded in the boiler, but as the name suggests, that was experimental in lots of ways, and you can't draw a line from it to later engines. It was Lancashire Witch with its 45-degree inclined cylinders that was the real ancestor of the horizontal cylinders that would become standard. In fact, as we'll see today, Robert Stephenson used Lancashire Witch as the prototype to test several ideas he'd incorporate into rocket. OK, on with the show. We're going to look at the wider Liverpool and Manchester Railway in episode 6. For now, it's enough to say that in 1828 their line was progressing reasonably well. But the directors of the company were faced with an increasingly urgent question, one that would have been familiar to the committee of the S&DR. What form of motive power should they use? It's hard for us today to think of railways as meaning anything other than locos, but that was far from a foregone conclusion in the 1820s. While the debate on the S&DR had been between horses and steam power, the L&MR 3 years later had no real proponents of horsepower at all. Steam power had proven itself superior. But there was a real question as to the form that steam power would take. Should it be locomotives, like the S&DR was now using successfully to pull goods? Or should there be a series of stationary engines along the line? By the time of the L&MR's debate, George Stephenson was back as the company's engineer, and if you're wondering what that means, you'll just have to wait for episode 6 to find out. But as you can imagine, Stephenson was passionately arguing for locomotives, and there were several of the board who agreed with him, but there were at least as many who didn't. And since the directors couldn't resolve it for themselves, they embarked on an approach that will be familiar to anyone who's ever been part of a decision-making group. They put off the decision by making a subcommittee and asking it for a report. Then, when the report didn't help them decide, they knuckled down and decided for themselves. Only joking, they asked for another report. This second report was produced by John Earthpeth Rastrick and James Walker, both very credible engineers of their day. Walker only plays this small part in our story, but he'd go on to become the president of the Institute of Civil Engineers, and Rastrick, as well as having a phenomenal middle name, had helped build Trevithick's Catch Me Who Can in 1808. We'll meet him again shortly, as he was one of the judges in the trials. But before we get there, the two men issued their report. It was a fair assessment of the state of the engines at the time. They visited working railways with locos and stationary engines, and made careful measurements on every basis you could imagine. Relative speeds, power, capital costs, and the operating costs, from wage costs for maintenance staff right down to wear and tear on rope. It's a very detailed report, running to 48 pages. What it didn't do was answer the question. That's probably a bit unfair. It did answer the question. It said that stationary engines had the edge, but Walker and Rastrick made it clear that it was a very close-run thing, and they expected locos to improve, while stationary engines probably wouldn't. So it left the question open, but this time there was a suggestion that would actually resolve it once and for all. If locomotives needed to be improved, then why not hold a competition to encourage inventors to make those improvements? If engines turned up on the day and were genuinely better than the current state of the art, then great, the directors would be able to go with locomotives. If not, then they'd have their answer, stationary engines. This is the key point that's missing from the public perception of Rainhill. What we think of as a race between locos was really a test to prove that any of them were a viable option. The engines in the Rainhill Trials were all racing against an option that wasn't there. So Rastrick and Walker presented their report in March, and by the end of April, the board was organising the competition. Adverts appeared in newspapers across the country that read, "To engineers and iron founders, the directors of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway hereby offer a premium of £500 over and above the cost price for a locomotive engine, which may be a decided improvement on any hitherto constructed." Over the next few months, the directors agreed the minimum criteria that the engines had to meet to enter the competition. They were: the engine must be smokeless. That was essential, because it was a condition laid down in the 1827 Act that authorised the line. If the engine weighed 4.5 tons or less, it could have 4 wheels, and it must be capable of pulling a 15-ton train at 10 miles an hour. If it weighed 6 tons, then it had to have 6 wheels and pull a 20-ton train. It needed to have 2 safety valves, one that the driver couldn't reach. There'd been a number of boiler explosions, including locomotion number 1, interestingly. And the most common explanation for them was that the drivers kept tampering with the safety valves. It had to be supported on springs, and the top of the chimney had to be less than 15 feet high. It had to cost no more than £550, and entering the competition was at the builder's risk. The company weren't obliged to buy any engine that they didn't approve. And finally, the boiler had to withstand a pressure of up to £150 per square inch. The usual operating pressure would be 50 psi, which was fairly standard for the time. Locomotion number 1 worked at 50 psi, but insisting on a higher maximum pressure would drive the inventors to come up with safer boilers. The details of the tests were left for the judges to decide. So who were those judges? Well, the company appointed 3 men to judge the competition: John Rastrick, Nicholas Wood, and John Kennedy. Kennedy was a businessman and engineer, an amateur one at least, who had invented a method of spinning fine yarn. Born in Scotland, he moved to Manchester when he was 15, and by the time of the trial he was a well-respected merchant. And that's the last time we're going to mention him. He doesn't seem to have taken any active part in the trials, and short of having his name listed as a judge, he isn't referred to again in any source I've read. The real judging was done by Rastrick and Wood. We met Rastrick earlier. At the time of the trials he was 49, and a successful mechanical and civil engineer. He had designed the iron bridge over the River Wye at Chepstow, fabricated ironwork that was used in the building of the British Museum, acted as the engineer for the Stratford and Moreton Railway, and built the Stourbridge Lion for the Delaware and Hudson Railway in the United States. And, of course, he'd done the most recent assessment for the LNMR that we saw earlier. Nicholas Wood has been behind the scenes throughout our story so far. He joined Killingworth Colliery in 1811, the same year that George Stephenson became the engine wright, and the 2 men seem to have struck up a close friendship. 4 years later, Wood, who had just become the colliery manager, acted as draftsman for Stephenson's safety lamp. That was the one that later won George the £1,000 he used to fund his shares in Robert Stephenson and Company. And the 2 men were together when they went to meet Edward Pease for the first time. But in case you get the wrong idea, Wood definitely wasn't just Stephenson's stooge. In 1825 he was well respected enough in his own right to author one of the first books on railways, which I quoted in episode 1. And in 1827 he had enough of a reputation to be invited to give evidence before Parliament on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway Act. So, these are our judges, men who know engines about as well as anyone in the country, and certainly well enough to test them thoroughly. But what about the competitors themselves? Who would respond to an advert like the one the directors had placed? Well, according to Henry Booth, the company treasurer, and a name you'll be hearing more of in a short while, all sorts of folks did. Proposals flooded in from across the country and beyond. With a fair heap of ridicule, but precious little detail, he lists ideas that included reducing the friction of the carriages until they could be pulled by a silk thread, power being supplied by mysterious columns of water, and finally out-and-out perpetual motion machines. He concludes, with characteristic 19th century understatement, "Every scheme which the restless ingenuity or prolific imagination of man could devise was liberally offered to the company. The difficulty was to choose and decide." Luckily for him, they didn't have to decide, or even read them. It was up to the inventors themselves to produce their machines and bring them to the trials. In the months leading up to the trial, Mechanics magazine referred to 10 credible designs that they knew were underway, but there's only a record of 6 turning up on the day itself. Only 5 of those actually entered, and only 4 of those were steam engines. So, let's meet them and the engines they put forward before we get to the trials themselves. The 6 inventors were Ross Winans, Thomas Shaw Brandreth, Timothy Burstall, John Braithwaite and John Ericsson acting as a team, Timothy Hackworth, and Robert Stephenson. I've included the first 2 for a mix of completeness and light relief, I suppose. We can dispose of them relatively quickly. Ross Winans was an American engineer on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, who would also go on to play a part in establishing the railways of Russia. He and a number of other engineers had been sent to England by the Baltimore and Ohio Company to examine the railways here. They were apparently in England from November 1828 through to May 29, so it's possible that he wasn't actually present at Rainhill himself, but his machine definitely was. The report of the first day that appeared in the Times specifically tells us that Mr. Winans' machine, worked by 2 men and carrying 6 passengers, was also on the ground. It moved with no great velocity compared with the locomotive steam carriages, but with considerable speed considering that it was put in motion by human power. It's easy to forget, looking back, that the pedal-powered bicycle hadn't even been invented at this point. The story of the invention of bikes is a lot less clear than the story of the steam engine, but at the time of the Rainhill Trials, a successful pedal-powered machine was still about 30 years in the future. So a human-powered carriage was actually pretty impressive. That said, Winan is never referred to as a formal entrant at Rainhill, and he's not mentioned in any of the other contemporary accounts. But while his appearance here is brief, his contribution to American railroads is without question. He dropped the human-powered idea quickly enough that it's almost never mentioned in his biographies. Instead, he focused on steam locos when he returned to the States, and he went on to found one of the first railroad fortunes, apparently becoming one of America's first multimillionaires. That probably wouldn't have been obvious from the machine he displayed at Rainhill. The other non-steam-powered machine that was there that day was Thomas Brandreth's entry. This gets mentioned a lot more often. Brandreth had until very recently been a director of the LNMR, and he decided to enter the competition with an invention of his own, the horse-powered Cycloped. The Cycloped was a 4-wheeled carriage powered by 2 horses walking on a treadmill. There's a picture at historyoftherailways.com/episode 4, but to be honest, it looks exactly as you'd imagine it would look. It's a wheeled platform with rails keeping a horse in the middle. Brandreth is generally only mentioned in connection with the trials to point out how behind the times the idea of a horse-powered machine was. And the thing is, that's not really fair. He was without doubt a very intelligent man. He'd been awarded Cambridge University's second highest award in mathematics the year he graduated. He worked as a barrister, and later in life published an edition of Homer's Iliad in ancient Greek that was closer to the Greek of Homer's time than previous editions, his particular bugbear being that a letter had fallen out of use in ancient Greek before the Iliad was written down, but that Homer would have used it. Anyway, I'm definitely off topic, but the point is, he wasn't an idiot. Even his horse-powered entry in the trials was not as stupid as it seems to us now. First, he'd written to his ex-colleagues before entering to check if the competition was exclusive to steam-powered locos, and they told him it wasn't. Then, there was a strong canal and turnpike lobby still pushing for the restriction of steam-powered speeds. Only to protect the public from the dangers of high-speed travel, of course, not to protect their own interests. If those groups had been successful, then the benefits to be gained from high-speed locos wouldn't have been realised at all, and the simpler Cycloped may not have been such a bad idea. And finally, it's worth knowing that a practically identical horse-powered loco called the Flying Dutchman did actually work for a while on a railroad in South Carolina in the US. Apparently it was able to carry 12 passengers at 12 miles an hour. There was, of course, no way that Cycloped could compete against the locos on the day, as we'll see, but as it happened, one of the horses reportedly fell through the platform, which presumably gave Rastrick and Walker the excuse they needed to discount it from the running. In any case, they never mention it in their reports. So, both Brandreth and Winans may look a bit daft to us in retrospect, but they probably didn't at the time. Although, trying to use muscle-powered locomotion to win at Rainhill does feel a little bit like bringing a knife to a gunfight. But in any case, that brings us to the 4 more serious entries. Timothy Burstall's Perseverance, Braithwaite and Ericsson's Novelty, Hackworth's Pareil, and the Stephensons and Booth's Rocket. Booth's Rocket? What? Hold on, all will become clear, I promise. We'll deal with Timothy Burstall first. Burstall was born in Scotland in 1776, making him 53 at the time of the trials. We don't know a lot about him, or the engine he entered, which he called Perseverance. What we do know is that he had previously patented 2 steam-powered road carriages. Neither seems to have been particularly successful, but both worked well enough to get some attention. We don't even know what Perseverance looked like. Henry Booth, yes, that name again, bear with me, didn't describe it in his account of the trials written shortly afterwards, and neither did Nicholas Wood when he released an updated edition of his respected practical treatise that included a description of the trials. Now I can still hear some of you thinking, hang on, I've seen an image of Perseverance, how can you say we don't know what it looked like? And that's because there is an image that's always associated with it now, but it only comes from Marshall's 1953 History of Railway Locomotives. Marshall found the image and believed it to be Perseverance, but before that there are no attested images. 30 years before Marshall, when Young was writing Timothy Hackworth and the Locomotive, he illustrated Burstall's entry with a picture of one of his road carriages and the note that it was on similar mechanical lines to Perseverance. Of course, Marshall may have been right, the picture might be Perseverance, but I'm inclined to think it isn't for a simple reason. When Booth described Novelty, which we'll discuss shortly, he said it was so far novel as to carry the requisite quantity of water and fuel on the same carriage with the engine. In other words, it was a tank engine, and the first he'd ever seen. Surely if he'd seen another one as part of the same trial, he'd have mentioned it. Anyway, all we can say for sure about Perseverance is that it weighed 2 tons and 1,700 weight, and had a vertical boiler with a chimney that vented directly without a flue. We don't even know how many wheels it had, although if you had to guess, then I'd assume it ran on 4 wheels because of how far under the weight limit it was. I should say, we do know that the wheels were painted red for the trials, but I can't say as I find that particularly enlightening. Anthony Dawson, in a discussion of his excellent book The Rainhill Trials, suggests that in fact the Perseverance may have just been Burstall's second road carriage repurposed. Given that this road carriage was being demonstrated in July 1829 and the Rainhill Trials took place just 3 months later, he may well be onto something, or at the very least that Burstall reused significant parts of the road carriage. On that basis, I've added a picture of that road carriage at historyoftherailways.com/episode 4 for you to check out. But as we'll see, whatever Perseverance's design, Burstall was probably simply outclassed by the other engineers that made it to the trial, which, sad as it is, may well be why we don't know much about him. So let's move along to John Braithwaite and John Ericsson. Braithwaite is much better known than Burstall. Born in 1797, he came from a family who had run a foundry for over a century before his grandfather branched out into well sinking and the manufacture of pumps. If you think back to episode 2, when we looked at the history of steam power, pumps were the driving force of steam engine development long before it was used for motive power, and it was on these that John Braithwaite cut his teeth. His father, also called John, died in 1818, having been the victim of a highway robbery, which sounds vaguely romantic until you remember that it's basically just a 19th century mugging. Before his untimely death, though, John Sr. had done well and left his children a substantial inheritance. Our John inherited the engineering business and quickly became recognised as an expert in pumps and steam power more generally. In 1820, he installed air pumps as part of the ventilation for the old House of Commons, a building that would burn down in 1834. In 1826, he was joined by a young engineer from Sweden, John Ericsson. Ericsson was 6 years younger than Braithwaite, and had been widely recognised as something of a child genius in his native Sweden. He carried out independent canal surveys at 14. His real passion, though, was for inventing, and it was that brought him to England and to Braithwaite's door. In 1828, the two men combined Braithwaite's expertise in water pumps, Ericsson's inventiveness, and the new science of steam power to make a steam-powered fire engine. Their fire engines were called to the scene of several high-profile London fires in the early 1830s, including the fire at Parliament that destroyed the old House of Commons and Braithwaite's air pumps. But of most importance to our story, it seems that the fire engine also formed the basis of their design for the entry to Rainhill, the Novelty. Novelty was an 022WT, though I've also seen it described as a 220 as there's no obvious front. It had 2 vertical cylinders, 6 inches by 12 inches. Its wheels were 4 foot 2 inches in diameter, and drive was passed to them via a cranked axle. Obviously this became a standard loco feature, but this was actually the first time one was used on a locomotive. The engine as a whole weighed 3 tons and 1,500 weight. Air was fed to the fire by bellows driven by the cylinders. But it was the boiler that was the most interesting part, or as Wood called it, its prominent peculiarity. The boiler was in 2 parts. The most obvious to spectators was a large cylinder running vertically through one end of the frame. But this was considerably smaller than the boilers on either the Pareil or the Rocket. I haven't seen exact dimensions, but it's about 2.5 feet in diameter and 6 feet tall. To the crowd at Rainhill, though, it will have looked even smaller, because about a third of it sits below the frame. This vertical section of boiler contained the firebox. To get an idea of how the firebox was arranged without the benefit of a picture, which of course you'll find in the show notes, just imagine another cylinder in the centre of the first one. Half fill the outside one with water and light a fire in the inside one. And that's basically the idea. Now, of course, Braithwaite and Ericsson's design was a bit more complicated than that. The firebox wasn't really a straight cylinder. It had a fatter bottom for the fire grate and a thinner neck that acted as a chimney. But our cylinders in cylinders example comes close enough. And it makes one restriction obvious. You can't add fuel in the way you can on a normal loco. It has to be dropped down the chimney. But I said there were 2 parts of the boiler, and it's the other section that's most interesting. Joined to that vertical section was a horizontal cylindrical tank 10 feet long by 1 foot 1 inches in diameter. It ran along the length of the loco below the frame. It was in this section that the flue was placed to transfer the heat from the fire to the water. Ericsson's design, because it was the Swede who did most of the design work with Braithwaite casting the role of builder, was a significant improvement on the single flue that was common on most engines. He ran a 4-inch diameter flue through the horizontal boiler with 2 returns, narrowing slightly to improve gas flow through it. This meant that the total flue length was 31 feet, massively increasing the heating surface area. The design was clever. In fact, an analysis in 2006 determined that it was the most efficient of the competitors at transferring the heat of the fire to the water. But that very cleverness meant it was more complicated than any of the other entrants, and, as we'll see when we get to the trials, that would cause Braithwaite and Ericsson problems. Which brings us to Timothy Hackworth and his son Pareil. We've seen in the last 2 episodes that Hackworth had been building locomotives since the early days at Wylam. By the time he entered the competition at Rainhill, he was 43 and had been involved with locos for 18 years, the last 4 of which he'd spent as the superintendent of permanent and locomotive engines on the S&DR. At this point, the S&DR was running 6 engines, the largest fleet of locos anywhere, and Hackworth was the man responsible for ensuring they were in working order. So Hackworth has been, if not exactly centre stage, then at least a key player in our story so far. But I haven't taken the opportunity to introduce him properly. So here goes, Timothy Hackworth in 1 minute. Hackworth had been born in Wylam, the very same small town as George Stephenson. He joined Wylam Colliery at 14 as an apprentice blacksmith, and by 1810 he was foreman blacksmith. William Headley had recognised the young smith's potential, and the two worked together on all of the Wylam engines. When Robert Stephenson had left for South America and the new 4th Street Works needed a reliable manager, it was Hackworth that George Stephenson turned to. Stephenson even offered him the chance to become a partner in the works, but for reasons we don't know, Hackworth refused. Robert Young, whose 1923 book I've quoted from a couple of times, and who was actually Hackworth's grandson, which I don't think I've mentioned before, implies that Hackworth wanted to be his own man. But that's just supposition, and it's kind of contradicted by his next move. A couple of months later, Stephenson recommended him to the S&DR as their chief engineer, and as we've seen, Hackworth accepted. If I had to indulge in a bit of armchair psychology across the intervening 200 years, I'd guess that Hackworth was exactly the kind of dependable man you need to run a business. But he didn't combine it with the risk-taking entrepreneurial mindset that so many of the more famous 19th century engineers, including George Stephenson, did. He was, however, a devout Methodist and family man, who had 9 children eventually, 7 of whom had already been born by the time of the Rainhill Trials. So, that's the man, or at least the broad brushstrokes of the man as far as we need to know him at the moment. What about the engine he entered? The Son Pareil was an altogether more traditional design than Novelty or Rocket, as we'll meet in a moment. Working at the S&DR with the locomotion-style engines from Robert Stephenson & Co., Hackworth had incrementally improved the existing design, culminating in his 1827 060 Royal George and 1829 Victory. Amongst other things, he says, avoiding discussions of blast pipes, he introduced the return flue and developed a new adjustable spring-operated safety valve. It's probably fair to say that these locomotives represent the pinnacle of the Killingworth Colliery-style engine, and they formed the basis for Hackworth's entry to Rainhill. Son Pareil was an 040. He reduced his 060 design to save weight, with 2 vertical cylinders 7 inches by 18, a boiler that was 6 feet long and 4 foot 2 inches in diameter, with wheels that were 4 foot 6 inches and coupled with rods, and it weighed 4 tons 15.5 hundredweight. And so we get to Rocket. But before we introduce the engine, we should cover the men responsible, George and Robert Stephenson, and, of course, Henry Booth. As will be clear by now, if you didn't already know, George Stephenson, who's usually the only name associated with Rocket, deserves the least credit of all. And don't get me wrong, this is not going to be a George Stephenson bashing session. He was an incredibly impressive man, and I'll have plenty of great things to say about him soon enough. In fact, I'm thinking of doing a specific profile episode on him. The only thing making me hesitate is whether everyone listening to this already knows everything they want to about him, so feel free to get in touch and let me know what you think. But, and this is important, of the 3 men attached to Rocket, he actually did the least. His prominence in the public mind comes from a mix of his public relations skill and Robert Stephenson's modesty. In his 1857 biography of the Stephensons, Smiles quotes Robert as saying, "It was in conjunction with Mr. Booth that my father constructed the Rocket engine." But, to put it plainly, that's rubbish. While Rocket was being designed and built, George was concentrating on supervising the construction of the line. At best, he was someone useful for Robert to bounce ideas off, and he did less of that than Booth did. There are two men who deserve the real credit for Rocket: Robert Stephenson and Henry Booth. Robert Stephenson needs no more introduction than his father, so actually perhaps that profile episode should cover both of them together like Smiles did. Let me know. Anyway, when we last saw Robert, he was sailing off to South America, so it's probably enough to say here that he'd returned from Colombia in November 1827 and took up running the 4th Street works of the company that had his name. He quickly demonstrated that he was a force to be reckoned with, designing what was probably the first locomotive he'd had a hand in personally, the Lancashire Witch. In many respects, this engine was a prototype of Rocket. Lots of the improvements that made Rocket the winner at Rainhill. Oh, should I have called that out as a spoiler alert? Probably not. I'm guessing if you're listening to this, you know that Rocket wins. Anyway, lots of Rocket's improvements can be seen in an early form on Lancashire Witch. There's obviously a lot more to be said about Robert Stephenson throughout the series. Anyone who knows anything about early railway history knows his name. Henry Booth, on the other hand, is almost unknown. As I said when I mentioned him at the beginning of the episode, Henry Booth was the Liverpool and Manchester Railway treasurer. But for the role he played to make sense, you have to know that the treasurer in the 19th century was nothing like what we understand it to be today. Treasurers at that time varied widely from a simple accountant managing the books to something much more like what we'd think of as a CEO or Chief Operating Officer these days. And Booth was very evidently closer to the CEO end of the spectrum than the accountancy clerk end. He was born in 1788 in Manchester and had taken an interest in the LNMR early on, becoming company secretary and writing its first prospectus in 1822. 4 years later, when an Act of Parliament had been approved for the line, he was appointed to the joint roles of secretary and treasurer. Booth had been an active part of the board's debates about motive power that we saw earlier. In fact, he'd been one of the original subcommittees sent to the S&DR to get their recommendation. And throughout the argument, he'd been a champion of locomotives. His interest was clearly driven by more than just the fact that he thought they were the right answer financially. He was a mechanically minded man. As well as his pivotal involvement in Rocket, in the course of his career he invented a type of screw coupling for rolling stock, and a formula for axle grease, of all things. But what was his connection to Rocket? As we'll see when I describe the engine in a moment, Rocket had several innovations that helped it at Rainhill, but it's generally accepted that the main thing that brought it victory was its multi-tubular boiler. This was Booth's contribution. In April 1827, a year before the Rainhill Trials were announced, the LNMR board minutes include: "The treasurer reported that he had discovered a means for producing steam without smoke, which he considered might be applied to locomotives and other engines." The single-flue boilers based on George Stephenson's Killingworth designs had a problem that's fairly obvious to us in retrospect. If we pull it back to basics, we can see the problem. The engine runs on steam, so the point of the boiler was to transfer the heat of the fire to the water, converting the water to steam. And that transfer of heat can only take place where the water touches a surface that's heated by the fire. That means there are two problems with a large-bore single-flue, like the traditional Stephenson engines had been. One, lots of the energy from the fire runs through the centre of the flue and straight out of the chimney. It does nothing to heat the surface that the water touches. And two, lots of the water in the boiler isn't near the surface of the flue, so the heat has to be transferred through the water itself. Water isn't as good at conducting heat as the metal of the flue, so that makes the boiler overall less efficient. Both of those problems are reduced by using a return flue, which doubles the amount of pipe in the boiler, of course. But even return flue boilers weren't very efficient at raising steam. This was the problem that Ericsson was trying to solve with his novel boiler design, and Booth's solution went even further than Ericsson's. Instead of a single large flue, or the looping of a return flue that was taken to an extreme in Ericsson's design, Henry Booth proposed using several separate tubes carrying the hot gases from the firebox through the boiler. This simultaneously solved both problems. Fitting multiple pipes into the same boiler space meant they had to be narrower, so they inevitably had more surface area for a given volume. As a result, less of their heat was wasted. And having more tubes running through the water meant that more of the water in the boiler was heated by direct contact with a pipe, rather than just being conducted through the water itself. As I suggested a moment ago, a version of the idea was tried out on Lancashire Witch, but it didn't go anywhere near as far as the one Booth designed for Rocket. In Rocket, there were 25 tubes. They were made of copper and were 3 inches in diameter. It's only fair to point out, as Francis Trevithick did years later, that his father Richard had patented a 3-tubed boiler in 1802, and had experimented with tubes of narrower diameters. But this is honestly very different from the genuine multi-tubular boiler of Booth. It's also true that Marc Seguin was developing a multitubular boiler for locomotives in France at exactly the same time, and that multitubular boilers have been used in applications apart from locomotives as well. But as far as we can tell, Booth knew nothing of Seguin's work, and really does deserve the credit for coming up with it independently. The real lesson here is not that someone else invented the multitubular boiler, but rather that for most ideas it's impossible to truly credit one person alone. The myth of the lone genius is almost always just that, a myth. Actually, it reminds me of one of my favourite misunderstood quotes of all time by Isaac Newton. "If I've seen further than other men, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." That's kind of the point I'm making here. Did Booth really invent the multitubular boiler? Yes. Was he drawing on ideas that were floating around at the time? Of course he was. You can't be alive and not do that. And this is totally off topic, but the reason I love that Newton quote is precisely because it's misunderstood. People think of it as this modest, inspirational line by a genius, but that's not even close. Newton wrote it in a public letter to Robert Hooke, who was another 17th century scientist, and they were having a long-running bitter argument in which Hooke accused Newton of stealing his ideas. This was part of Newton's response, so he's half admitting that, yes, I did base my ideas on yours. But the real kicker comes when you know, as Newton and all of his readers did, that Robert Hooke had a physical deformity that made him stoop over. He was considered at the time to be a dwarf, so not a giant. Isaac Newton, genius? Yes. Nice chap? Not so much. Anyway, clearly Isaac Newton and Robert Hooke have nothing to do with Rainhill. It's just a story I've always found amusing. So back to Henry Booth, who genuinely does deserve to be remembered more widely. Which is strange, because his involvement was no secret at the time. When Rocket won the competition, the prize was awarded to the Stephensons and Booth collectively. Everybody in 1829 knew of Booth's part, but as the decades passed, the better-known George Stephenson came to be the only person the public at large thinks built Rocket. People with slightly more knowledge may add Robert to the mix, but you'd have to travel far and wide to find anyone who'd ever heard of Henry Booth. History can be cruel, much like Isaac Newton. But having credited Booth with the boiler, I should be clear. The idea was Booth's. As is often the case, turning a good idea into something that worked in practice was no small feat in itself, and that was down to Robert Stephenson and his team at 4th Street. One of his draftsmen would later say, "I can bear witness to the care and judgment bestowed by him," that is, Robert Stephenson, "upon every detail. The arrangement of the tubes with the method of securing their extremities, the detached firebox, and many other matters of detail." In fact, another of the strengths of Rocket's design is alluded to there, the separate firebox. Until this point, the fire was usually lit in the end of the flue tube. The multi-tube design of Rocket prevented that option, so a separate firebox had to be made, and this firebox was surrounded by a water jacket, which was connected to the main boiler by 4 pipes. Now, whether that separate firebox was a planned improvement or just a consequence of the multiple tubes, it definitely had the effect of increasing the heat that was transferred from the fire. Pareil had the traditional approach of housing the fire in the end of the flue tube. Hackworth added a small water jacket to draw more heat from the fire, but it was a much less effective method. So, that's Rocket's boiler. What was the rest of Rocket like? Well, it was an 022. The drive wheels were 4 feet 8.5 inches, while the trailing wheels were designed as much smaller 2 feet 6 inches wheels, although we'll see at the trial that wasn't quite true on the day. With 2 inclined cylinders, 8 inches by 17. Robert Stephenson had set the cylinders of the Lancashire Witch at 45 degrees so that the drive wheels could have spring suspension. Rocket used the same idea, but at a slightly lower angle of 38 degrees. The boiler was 6 feet long and 3 foot 4 inches in diameter, and it weighed 4 tons 500 weight. Rocket also had a number of other new innovations. None of them alone would affect the outcome, but when you take them together, you can see the effort Robert Stephenson was putting in to make the engines as practical and what today we'd call user-friendly as possible. These included the flying reverse, which shifted the engine into reverse by the driver pressing a pedal, and a gauge that meant that the water level in the boiler could be told at a glance, instead of having to turn tricocks attached to the boiler. So, that's all of our competitors. Putting Cycloped and Mr. Winans' unofficial entry aside, we've got 4 entrants that represented just about the full range of approaches to locomotive design in the late 1820s. We could think of them as 1. Recapitulation. In Perseverance, Burstall was seeking to use existing road steam carriage technology without any particular change. To win, he'd have had to build it better than his competitors. 2. Optimisation. Hackworth's goal for Pareil was to squeeze the most improvement possible out of the traditional locomotive design. 3. Evolution. For Rocket, Henry Booth and the Stephensons had taken their traditional design and gone back to the drawing board. preserving what they felt worked and reimagining core elements wherever they could. And 4, revolution. With Novelty, Braithwaite and Ericsson were attempting to leave the traditional locomotive design behind as far as possible. They were all hoping that their approach would be the one that would prove locomotives were better than stationary engines. And, let's not kid ourselves, that they were better than their rivals. In the next episode, we'll see exactly how far that hope takes each of them when we get to the trial itself. But before we go, here's today's trivia question. Whose 060 Dreadnought was intended to compete in the Rainhill Trials, but wasn't completed in time? Don't miss the next episode for the answer, and if you can't wait that long, then check out historyoftherailways.com, where you'll find episode show notes and the answer to today's question. So, come and join me on the next episode as we look at how our erstwhile competitors get on at the Rainhill Trials. If you're enjoying the show, please like, subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, you can find relevant images and links to the source material I used for research on historyoftherailways.com, where you'll also find ways to support the show. If you want to get in touch, then just drop me a line at michael@historyoftherailways.com or follow us on Facebook and join the conversation there. So tell your friends to come and join us on the next episode as we get distracted, fascinated and yes, even sidetracked by the stories from the history of the railways.